Greetings, Pack. Tonight's story begins with smoke. Not the kind that signals disaster, the kind that signals someone is still cooking, still tending, still keeping something alive when everything around them is burning. Wren had 9 mouths to feed and no good reason to trust the man who showed up at her door following the trail of that smoke. She had even less reason to let him in. She did it anyway. That decision would change everything, for her, for the pups, and for a king who had spent 3 years convincing himself he didn't need anything that could be taken from him. Let's begin. The fire came from the east on a Tuesday, which Wren would later think was the cruelest detail. Tuesdays were market days in the valley towns. People were out in the open, on the roads, carrying baskets of bread and winter squash, and the fire moved faster than anyone had planned for. She heard it before she saw it. A sound like the forest exhaling all at once, a long, sustained rush that her body understood before her mind caught up. She was already out the cabin door and moving toward the tree line before the first column of smoke cleared the ridge. She found the first pup under a fallen pine, small enough to cup in both hands, its fur singed along one haunch. She found 2 more in the creek bed, shivering. The others she collected in pieces over the next 3 hours, moving through the smoke-hazed forest, in a grid she mapped in her head, the way her father had taught her to search. Methodical, no backtracking, no panic. By the time she came back to the cabin the 4th time, she had 9. 9 wolf pups, none older than 8 weeks, at least 2 of them injured, all of them terrified. She had a cellar. She put them in it. This is the part of the story where a more cautious person would have stopped, would have assessed the situation, considered the risk, thought carefully about what it meant to harbor 9 wolf pups when the territory above her cabin belonged to the Ironhold pack, and the Ironhold pack had very specific opinions about their young. Wren was not a cautious person. She was a practical one, which is a different thing entirely. The pups were cold and injured, and the cellar was the warmest, safest space she had. She put them in it. She built up the fire in the hearth above. She heated broth from the bones she'd been saving, and she began the work of keeping 9 small animals alive. She was a healer. This was what healers did. The cellar had a trap door in the kitchen floor, heavy oak reinforced with iron bands, and she kept it closed. She went down every 2 hours to check on them, to clean wounds, to coax the reluctant ones into drinking. The 2 injured pups, one with a burned paw, one with a gash along its ribs she suspected came from debris rather than the fire itself, required more careful attention. She worked quietly and efficiently, the way she did everything, and she did not let herself think too hard about what would happen when someone came looking. Someone always came looking. He came on the 3rd day. She smelled the smoke on him before she heard his footsteps. Not the wildfire smoke, which had faded to a gray haze over the valley, but the particular smell of a man who had been riding through ash country for days. Her door was open because she was airing out the cabin, and she was at the table with her back to it, grinding dried willow bark when the shadow fell across the threshold. She did not turn around immediately. "You're on Ironhold land," the voice said. It was a low voice, the kind that had learned not to need volume to carry weight. Flat and careful, each word set down like something heavy. "I know," Wren said. She kept grinding. "I've been on Ironhold land for 4 years. My lease is current. You're welcome to check the records." A pause. She heard him step inside without being invited, which told her something about who he was. "There are pups missing from the eastern dens," he said. 9 of them. The fire scattered them before the pack could account for them. "That's terrible," Wren said. Another pause. This one was longer and had a different quality to the first. "The smoke trail from your chimney is the only one still burning in this section of the valley," he said. "Every other structure either burned or shuttered." She set down the grinding stone. She turned around. He was bigger than she'd registered from the shadow, broad through the shoulders, the kind of build that came from actual use rather than performance. He was dressed in riding clothes, dark and ash-dusted, and he had the kind of face that had learned to give nothing away, though she could see the exhaustion underneath it if she looked directly. Gray eyes. The particular stillness of someone who had spent a long time learning to hold still. Behind him, through the open door, she could see two other men waiting in the yard. Both of them were watching the cabin with the focused attention of people who had been told to wait and were very much not comfortable with waiting. She looked at the man in her doorway for a long moment. "The pups are in the cellar," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not relief exactly. Something more careful than relief. "All 9? "All 9. 2 are injured. One has a burned paw that will need watching for infection. The other took a cut to the ribs. I've cleaned it and stitched it, but he needs to stay still for another few days at minimum." She paused. "I was going to send word to the pack once I knew they were stable. I didn't know who to send to." "You could have sent to anyone," he said. "Anyone in the valley would have known to bring word to me." "I don't know anyone in the valley," she said. "I'm a healer. I work alone." He looked at her for another moment. It was the kind of look that was taking inventory, not rude, not aggressive, but thorough. She held it without difficulty. She had been looked at by people trying to decide what she was before, and she had learned that the best response was simply to be exactly what she was and let them figure it out. "I'd like to see them," he said. "I know," she said, and moved to lift the trapdoor. His name was Kylam. She learned this not from him, but from one of the men in the yard, who called it through the door when the second man needed a decision made about the horses. Kylam. She filed it away without knowing why. He crouched at the edge of the trapdoor and looked down into the cellar, and she watched him take in the 9 pups arranged on the old horse blankets she'd layered across the stone floor, the small clay bowls of broth, the careful bandaging on 2 of them. She watched something move through his face that he didn't quite manage to keep still. "You did all this alone," he said. It wasn't a question. "There was no one else," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The injured ones. You said a burned paw and stitched ribs. The gray one with the white chest, and the dark one in the far corner, the one that keeps trying to stand up when it shouldn't." He made a sound that might have been almost a laugh. It was very quiet and very brief, and she suspected it surprised him as much as it surprised her. "That one's always been like that," he said. "Stubborn," she said. "Stubborn," he agreed, and something in the word was fond in a way that the rest of him hadn't been. He stayed for 2 hours. She had not expected that. She had expected him to confirm the pups, perhaps make arrangements to move them, and leave with his men. Instead, he sent his men back to the pack with word that the pups had been found and were being cared for, and he stayed. He went down into the cellar himself and checked each pup with a gentleness that was startling in a man of his size, his large hands moving carefully along small spines and ribs, checking her stitching without comment, pressing 2 fingers lightly against the burned paw to assess the heat of it. She stayed at the top of the ladder and watched. "Your work is good," he said from below. "I know," she said. He came back up. He looked at her again with that inventory expression. "Moving them now would set back the injured ones," he said. "Yes," she said. "How long before they can be safely transported?" "The ribs, 5 days, minimum. The paw is less certain. It depends on whether infection sets in." He nodded slowly. She could see him thinking, the particular quality of someone working through logistics they hadn't planned for. "I'll need to post someone here," he said. to watch over them. "You're welcome to post someone in the yard," she said. "The cellar is my space, and I'll manage what's in it." He looked at her. She looked back. "All right," he said, and it was the first time she'd heard him say something that sounded like it had cost him something. He came back the next morning. She had not expected that either. She was in the cellar when she heard his boots on the kitchen floor above her. She recognized them already. The particular weight and rhythm of how he walked, which was something she noted and did not examine too closely. She came up the ladder to find him crouched by the hearth, adding wood to the fire she'd let burn low, his back to her. "You don't have to do that," she said. "The fire was going out," he said. "I was going to rebuild it when I came up." "I was already here." She looked at the back of his head for a moment. He was wearing a plain wool shirt today, no riding coat, and she could see the tension across his shoulders that he was probably not aware of. She went to the table and began measuring out the morning's medicines. "How are they?" he asked without turning around. "Better. The stubborn one tried to climb the shelving unit at some point in the night. I've moved him to a crate." The almost laugh again. Still brief, still quiet. "And the burned paw?" "No infection yet. I'm cautiously optimistic." He stood up from the fire and turned around, and she was struck again by how much space he occupied. Not aggressively, but simply as a fact of his presence, the way a large stone in a stream occupies space. He looked at the medicines she was measuring. "What's that?" he said. "Willow bark for the fever one, comfrey for the ribs. This," she held up a small brown vial, "is for the paw. It's a preparation my father developed. It's better than anything the pack healers will have, which is not me being arrogant. It's just a fact." "I believe you," he said. He said it simply, without qualification, and she found that she believed that he meant it. He sat down at her table. She did not invite him, and he did not ask, and she decided that this was simply how he operated, and she would deal with it. She went on measuring. He watched her work with the same inventory attention he'd turned on her the day before, and she let him, because she had nothing to hide, and the work was more interesting than the watching. "You said you've been here 4 years," he said after a while. "Yes." "I didn't know there was a healer in this section of the valley. Most people don't until they need one. And then they find you. And then they find me," she agreed. He was quiet again. She had begun to understand that his silences were not uncomfortable. They were simply the spaces he left around words, the way some people needed more room between thoughts than others. She found she didn't mind them. "You live here alone," he said. "Yes." "No family." "My father died 3 years ago. He was the one who held the lease originally. I renewed it in my name." "That's unusual." "I'm aware," she said, and her voice was dry enough that he looked at her again, sharply, and she thought she caught the edge of something that might have been appreciation. He came back the following morning, and the morning after that. By the 5th day, it had become a pattern she had stopped being surprised by, though she had not stopped noticing it. He arrived before the valley had fully woken up. He rebuilt the fire if it had burned low in the night, and he sat at her table while she prepared the morning medicines. Sometimes they talked. More often they didn't, and the silence was the particular kind that 2 people fall into when they have stopped performing comfort for each other and have arrived at the real thing. The pups were improving. The stubborn one had been released from the crate and was terrorizing the others with the energy of something that had been confined against its will. The burned paw was clean and healing. She was beginning to think about transport timelines. On the 5th evening, she was sitting on the cellar steps watching the pup sleep when she heard him come back. She had not expected him in the evening. The pattern had been mornings. She came up the ladder to find him standing in the middle of her kitchen, and something was different about him. The tension across his shoulders was higher. His jaw was set, and he had the look of a man who had come from somewhere difficult and had not yet finished carrying it. "Council meeting," she said, reading him without meaning to. He looked at her. "Yes." "About the pups?" "Among other things." He paused. "About you." She set the cellar door down carefully. "What about me?" "There are members of the council who feel that the correct response to finding a human healer harboring pack pups is not daily visits from the Alpha King," he said. "They've expressed this opinion with some force." She considered this. "Are they wrong?" He looked at her for a long moment. His jaw worked slightly. "No," he said. "They're not wrong. It's unusual." "Unusual," she said. "That's one word for it. What word would you use?" She thought about it honestly. "Complicated," she said. "I'd use complicated." He was quiet. She watched the tension in him and thought about what it cost a man who had learned to hold everything still to walk into a room full of people, demanding explanations for something he didn't fully have an explanation for. "What do they want?" she said. "For me to move the pups now. Tonight, regardless of the medical timeline." "The ribs aren't ready," she said immediately. "I know. Moving him now risks reopening the stitching. If the wound tears internally—" "I know," he said again, and his voice was flat and final, and she understood that he was not arguing with her, he was agreeing with her, and that this was the problem. "Then tell them no," she said. He looked at her. "You're the Alpha King," she said. "Tell them no. The pup stays until it's medically safe to move it. That's not a complicated position. It's a medical one." Something shifted in his face. Not much, just a fraction. "You make it sound simple," he said. "It is simple," she said. "The hard part is something else." He looked at her for a long time after that, and she let him look, and she did not look away. "Yes," he said finally. "The hard part is something else." He didn't leave immediately. He sat at her table again, and she made tea because the evening had gone cold and because it was something to do with her hands, and she put a cup in front of him without asking, and he wrapped both hands around it without comment. They sat on opposite sides of the table with the tea between them and the fire behind her and the trapdoor in the floor between their feet. And she thought about what it meant that a man who ran a pack of several hundred wolves kept coming back to her one-room cabin before the valley woke up. She thought about it, and she filed it away, and she went back to watching the fire. "Why did you come back?" she said. "After the first day." He looked at the tea. "The pups needed monitoring." "You have pack healers." "Yes." "You could have sent one?" "Yes." She waited. "I didn't want to send one," he said. She held his gaze. He held hers. Neither of them said anything for a moment that was too long and too short at the same time. "All right," she said, and went back to her tea. The council came on the 7th day. She heard them before she saw them. 4 horses, 2 of them carrying men in the formal dark coats of Ironhold Council members, one carrying a woman with the particular upright posture of someone who had spent decades being the most important person in any room she entered. They came up the path to her cabin with the careful, deliberate energy of people who had decided something and were here to make it official. Wren was outside when they arrived, hanging herbs to dry on the line she'd strung between the cabin corner and the old fence post. She did not stop what she was doing. The woman dismounted first. She had silver hair and sharp eyes, and she looked at Wren the way people sometimes looked at things they hadn't accounted for in their planning. "You're the healer?" she said. "I am," Wren said. She pinned a bundle of comfrey to the line. "Councillor Marin Valdis," the woman said. "I'm here on behalf of the Ironhold Council regarding the pack pups currently in your possession." "They're not in my possession," Wren said. "They're in my cellar. There's a difference." One of the men behind Councillor Valdis made a small sound. Wren didn't look at him. The council has voted to have the pups transferred to the pack healers immediately, Valdis said, regardless of your assessment of their readiness. One of them has stitched ribs, Wren said. Moving him now risks the wound. Our healers are capable of managing the risk. I'm sure they are, Wren said pleasantly. They're still not as capable as I am. My preparation for the burned paw has kept infection from setting in when your pack healer's standard treatment would likely have failed. That's not arrogance, that's a documented outcome. She pinned another bundle. You're welcome to observe the pup's condition before making a final decision. I'd recommend it. Valdis looked at her with the expression of someone recalibrating. The council also has concerns, she said more carefully, about the nature of the Alpha King's visits here. Wren turned and looked at her directly for the first time. What about them? They are frequent, informal, without escort in recent days. He's checking on the pups. So he has said. Then you have your answer. We have his answer, Valdis said. We'd like yours. Wren looked at her for a long moment. She thought about what was actually being asked, which was not about the pups at all, and she thought about how to answer it honestly without giving away anything that wasn't hers to give. He comes in the mornings, she said. He checks on the pups. He sits at my table. Sometimes we talk. He leaves. She paused. There is nothing in that account that requires your council's management. He is the Alpha King, Valdis said. Everything about him requires the council's attention. Then I'd suggest, Wren said, that the council pay attention to the things that actually affect the pack's welfare and leave the man's mourning habits to him. The silence that followed was the kind that meant she had gone further than was comfortable. She was aware of this and did not retreat from it. Kylam arrived 20 minutes later. She heard his horse before she saw him, and she saw the moment he registered the council horses in her yard. His shoulders shifted, something in his posture going very slightly more controlled, which she had learned was his version of preparing for something difficult. He dismounted and came through the gate and looked at the council and then at her, and she gave him the smallest possible nod that meant she was fine. Something in him settled, fractionally. Councillor Valdis, he said, I wasn't aware the council was visiting today. We weren't aware you'd be here, Valdis said, again. The pups are under medical care, he said. I'm monitoring their progress. Kylam. Valdis's voice shifted, less formal, more direct. The council is concerned. You know what we see when we look at this situation. Tell me, he said, and his voice was flat and final and gave nothing. A human woman, alone, with pack pups. A king who visits daily without escort. A bond that... She stopped. The yard went very quiet. Wren looked at Kylam. He was looking at Valdis with an expression she couldn't fully read, but she could see the jaw, the way it had gone tight, and she could see his hands, which were very still at his sides. A bond, Wren said. Everyone looked at her. Is that what this is about? She said. She kept her voice even. You think there's a bond? Valdis looked at her carefully. We think it's possible. Wren thought about the mornings, the fire rebuilt before she came up the ladder, the tea, the silences that had stopped being uncomfortable, the way she had started listening for his boots on the kitchen floor, the way she had, without deciding to, begun to think of the space across the table from her as his. She thought about all of this, and she kept her face very calm. That, she said, is between him and me. It is not, Valdis said, not unkindly. In Ironhold, a bond is a pack matter. It requires formal acknowledgement or formal dissolution. A bond that is neither named nor severed creates instability. Then perhaps, Wren said, someone should have explained that to me before the 8th morning. Kylam made a sound. It was very quiet. She thought it might have been her name. The council left an hour later with a formal deadline, 7 days for the bond to be named or dissolved, or the council would intervene in ways Valdis described as regrettable but necessary. Wren stood in the yard and watched them go and did not move until the sound of the horses had faded entirely. Then she turned around. Kylan was still there. He was standing by the fence, his arms crossed, looking at the ground, and he had the look of a man who had just had a private thing dragged into public light and was still deciding what to do about it. "Come inside," she said. He looked up. "Come inside," she said again. "We need to talk." He followed her in. She put more wood on the fire, and she did not offer tea this time because this was not a tea conversation. She sat down at the table, and she looked at him across it, and she waited. He sat down slowly. He put his hands flat on the table, which she had come to understand was what he did when he was trying to hold himself very still. "How long have you known?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Before you crossed the courtyard," he said. "When the gate opened, the first day." She held that for a moment. She thought about what it meant to know something on the first day and spend 7 days saying nothing. "Why didn't you say anything?" she said. "Because saying it makes it real," he said, "and real things can be lost." His voice was flat when he said it, the way his voice was always flat, but she could hear what was underneath it, the particular quality of someone who had learned this lesson in the most specific and painful way possible. "Tell me," she said. He looked at the table. 3 years ago," he said, "there was another bond. I named it." The woman left 4 months later, crossed into the Vale territory and didn't come back. He paused. "I spent a year looking. The bond faded when she crossed the border. I don't know if that was her choice or mine." Wren was quiet. "I decided," he said, "that naming things was what made them possible to lose. That if I didn't name it, it couldn't be taken." "And then I showed up," she said, "and then you showed up." He looked at her finally. "With 9 pups in your cellar, and no reason to trust any of us, and a complete unwillingness to be anything other than exactly what you are." She held his gaze. "And that was a problem." "That was a problem," he said, "because I couldn't explain you away. I couldn't decide you were nothing. I came back every morning because the alternative was not coming back, and I couldn't—" He stopped. His jaw tightened. "I couldn't do that." She thought about what it cost him to say that. She thought about the hands flat on the table, the controlled stillness, the 3 years of deciding that silence was protection. "I'm afraid," she said, "that you'll spend the rest of your life waiting for me to leave and miss the part where I don't." He looked at her. "I'm not her," she said. "I'm not going to tell you that means I'll stay forever, because I don't know that, and neither do you. But I've been in this valley for 4 years, and I renewed my lease in my own name, and I've never run from anything in my life." She paused. "I'm afraid of being someone's contingency plan. I'm afraid of being named and then held carefully at arm's length because you're too afraid of losing me to actually let me be here." She looked at him steadily. "That's what I'm afraid of." The silence was very long. "That's fair," he said. "I know it is. I don't know how to—" He stopped again, started again. "I have spent 3 years learning to hold everything still. I don't know if I remember how to not do that. You rebuilt my fire," she said, "every morning. You didn't ask. You just did it." She held his gaze. "That's not holding still. That's something else." Something in his face shifted. More than a fraction this time. More than she'd seen it shift before. "Yes," he said. "It is." She reached across the table and put her hand over one of his. His hands were still flat on the table, and her hand was small over his, and she felt him go very still in a different way. Not the controlled stillness, but the stillness of something that had finally stopped bracing. "Name it," she said, "and then let me be here. That's all I'm asking." He turned his hand over under hers. He held it. "All right," he said. The naming ceremony was held in the Ironhold courtyard 10 days later, on a morning that came with frost on the stone and a sky the particular pale gray of early winter. The entire pack was there. She had not expected that, the sheer number of them, filling the courtyard and the gallery above it and spilling out through the main gate into the yard beyond. She stood in the center of it in her good wool dress and her father's leather satchel over one shoulder because she had come from checking on a patient and hadn't had time to go home first. And she thought that this was probably not the dignified entrance most people made at their bonding ceremony. Caleb was waiting at the center of the courtyard. He was in formal dress, dark coat, the Ironhold chain across his shoulders, and he looked at her coming through the crowd, and his expression did the thing it did sometimes. The thing she had started to be able to read, which was not quite a smile, but was the place just before one. She walked toward him, and the pack went quiet around her, and then she felt it. The ripple. It started at the edges of the crowd and moved inward, a wave of people and wolves going still, heads lowering, the particular silence of a collective recognition. She had read about this in old pack law texts. She had translated descriptions of it in 3 different languages. She had never expected to be standing in the middle of one. She kept walking. When she reached him, he looked at her for a moment without speaking. "You brought your bag," he said. "I had a patient," she said. "On the morning of your bonding ceremony?" "He had a fever. It couldn't wait." The almost laugh, real enough this time that she heard it properly, and she thought it was a good sound, the kind of sound that had been waiting a long time to be used. The formal words were spoken by Counselor Valdis, who managed them with the careful precision of someone who had voted against this and was being professional about it. Wren said her part clearly and without hesitation. Kylam said his the way he said everything, flat and final, no explanation offered, none needed, except that when he said her name, it was not flat at all, and she thought that was the thing she would remember most. The pack exhaled, all of them, together, like something that had been held had finally been released. Afterward, in the quiet of the room he'd given her in the keep. Her cabin was being winterized, a project she had not requested and had stopped arguing about. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the fire he'd built in the hearth before she arrived, because of course he had, and she thought about 9 pups in a cellar and smoke rising from a chimney and a man who had followed it through ash country because something in him already knew. He came in without knocking, which was something she had also stopped arguing about. "The stubborn one bit Counselor Heron's boot," he said. She looked up. "At the ceremony?" "During the reception. Heron was making a speech." She considered this. "I can't say I'm sorry." "Neither can I." He sat down in the chair by the fire, the way he sat at her table, settled, like he'd always been there. "The pack healers have officially requested your notes on the burned paw treatment." "They can have them," she said. "I'll write them up this week." "They also asked if you'd be willing to consult on 3 other cases." "Tell them yes." She paused. "On the condition that I'm consulted, not overruled." "Noted," he said. He looked at the fire. She looked at him looking at it. "When did you know?" she said. "Really know. Not the gate opening." He was quiet for a moment. "When you told the council that the hard part was something else," he said. "And you were looking at me when you said it." She thought about that. "That was day 7. "Yes." "You waited 3 more days." "I was working up to it." She looked at him. He was looking at the fire, but she could see the edge of the almost smile. The real one. The one she was beginning to understand was hers specifically. Caleb, she said. He looked at her. The fire's fine, she said. You don't have to watch it. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he crossed the room and sat beside her on the edge of the bed, and she leaned into him slightly, and he put his arm around her, and they sat there together watching the fire that didn't need watching while the frost settled on the stone outside and the pack moved through the courtyard below, and somewhere in the keep 9 growing pups were causing problems for people who deserved it. The fire burned steadily. She had built it well. So had he. It would last the night. Pack, here's what I keep coming back to with this one. Caleb spent 3 years deciding that silence was the same thing as safety, that if he didn't name what he felt, he couldn't lose it. And then Wren walked through his gate carrying 9 orphan pups and a bone-handled medical kit, and she was so completely, stubbornly herself that he couldn't find a way to explain her away. She didn't ask him to be unafraid. She just asked him to name it and then let her be there. That's the whole thing. That's the whole story. So tell me, did Caleb wait too long, or did he wait exactly long enough? And what do you think Wren would have done if the council hadn't forced the conversation? I have a theory, and I think you do too. Drop it in the comments. I want to know if we're thinking the same thing. If this one hit, share it with someone who needs a story about a stubborn healer and a king who followed smoke through ash country. I'll see you at the next fire pack.